Well, good afternoon again. I want to spend some time on another portion of the midterm, which is the short answer. The first part, just briefly, is a letter. And I've actually given you the outline for what it should look like on the directions themselves. So just briefly on that part, what you're doing is you're writing a letter to one of these writers that we read in the first half of the semester. It's 4 paragraphs. You can take a look at the structure of it. Again, that's on Blackboard. And the reason I do this at the midpoint of the semester, and I do this every year, sometimes I do this assignment for the midterm. Sometimes I do it right after the midterm, so it kind of varies. I thought it would work well this year since we're online doing it as the actual midterm assignment. As I mentioned in the other video, you're looking back at the first half of the semester. So by writing a letter to one of the writers that we did thus far, I'm asking you to go back and look at not only their essay again, but also to look at the essay that you wrote about that person as a way to review it. Because again, as we get into November, you're going to have an opportunity to revise one of the earlier papers that we did in the class. So this is my way of having you start that process of looking back, taking a look at what you did in the first half, reflecting on it, and then having an opportunity to not only reflect on the work that you did, but also to reflect on what you read so far. So again, for the first half of the midterm, take a look at those directions. They're pretty clear and they're very specific in terms of what the outline and the structure of your letter should look like. So please email me if you have any questions on that. But the second part is very different. And as I mentioned in the other video, the second part is a preview of what we're going to be doing in the second half of the semester. That's where we change up the readings a little bit. And you're going to get readings, some of which will give you a hint of what you'd be doing if you're taking English 102 next semester. So I do some poetry. I do some excerpts from autobiographical comics or graphic novels. We do some other readings that are even more closely associated with Chicago and the greater Chicago area that we're in here. And so you're going to see that particularly with the poems. And I'll be honest with you, I love poetry. I think I get that particularly from my parents, actually. My mom loves poems. When I was a kid, she would go around quoting poetry that she likes. My dad is a big fan of country music and folk rock music, and so he also is really attuned to the lyrics from people like Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell and Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. So I kind of come from that, where my parents are really into words and the way words are used, not just in poetry, but in songs. My grandmother too was a big fan of the music of her generation, the swing generation. So I heard a lot of that music as well. So we're doing some poetry, and I hope you enjoy it. And I wanted to read for you a couple of the poems that you have to look at. That we're also going to write more about in the second half of the semester. Now, the response for the second half of the midterm is specifically on Jamila Woods, and I hope you like her poetry, particularly Daddy Dozens, which is a poem about her father. It's in tribute to her father. But she also shows some of the challenges that she had when she was a kid, and this was her father was working a lot and didn't always have the time to spend with her that she would have liked. And so a lot of the humor in the poem and the emotion of the poem as well, the undercurrent of maybe sadness, maybe sadness is too strong a word, but that undercurrent of longing, of wishing that she'd had more time to spend with her dad when she was a kid, is also in the poem. So when you read it, I hope you enjoy it. I've put some other samples of her up on Blackboard as well, but you want to read it slowly. Again, it's a fun poem. Any of the poetry that we do here in the middle of the semester is going to be very accessible, and again, I hope engaging and fun to read. I typically do a lot of these Chicago poets because they're close to home here, and they'll give you some insights into the world that you live in as well. In the suburbs, in the greater Chicago area, in the city itself. So let me just read these two short poems from Brooks and from Cisneros. And the reason I'm reading them and the reason I gave you them is that there's basically a lineage. So there's a tradition, particularly in Chicago poets, and a lot of contemporary Chicago poetry can be traced back to Gwendolyn Brooks. And I'll talk more about her after the midterm. But you really wouldn't have Jamila Woods without Gwendolyn Brooks and without Sandra Cisneros. And that's why I've given you Cisneros and Brooks as supplementary readings for now. We'll write more about them after the midterm, just to get you a sense of why Woods writes the way that she does, why she writes autobiographically, why she writes and how she writes about the city, and where she's taking inspiration from. So let me read you Gwendolyn Brooks' most famous poem. This is on Blackboard for you as well, and you can read this. And again, it'll give you some hip perspective, some insight into why Woods writes the way that she does, since she sees Brooks as one of her heroes. Okay, so Brooks for her is one of her real inspirations as a poet. And so here's Brooks's most famous poem. It's called We Real Cool. The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool. We left school. We lurk late. We strike straight. We sing sin. We thin gin. We jazz June. We die soon. That's a portrait. That's an image. That's an image from Brooks's neighborhood on the South Side. She spent most of her life living on the South Side of Chicago. Award-winning poet, also a great teacher. Woods would have been too young to have had her as a teacher in the classroom, but Cisneros, I think, did study somewhat with Brooks and knew her personally because, again, these are 2 Chicago poets of a different generation. And Brooks is one of the major Chicago writers of the last 50 years, along with Stuart Dybek, for example, and Nelson Algren and Richard Wright and other figures that maybe you've heard of. This is a portrait of school kids that she saw in her neighborhood who were skipping school. And they were at a place called the Golden Shovel, which was probably a bar, which they shouldn't have been in because they were underage. And she tries to imagine what maybe would have happened to them. Where did that leave them if they were skipping school and getting into trouble, drinking? At that point, listening to jazz music would have been considered sort of cutting edge too. This is written in the late 40s, early 50s. So this is really a portrait of her concern for those kids in her neighborhood. And when she maybe was walking home from work, saw them at the pool hall, or maybe was on break, I don't know, in the middle of the day, and saw them and wondered, what are they up to? Why aren't they in school? And what's going to happen to them in the long run? So there's a lot of compassion in that poem. And there's also a lot of very concrete details. I know the style might look a little bit unusual because she, again, writes in a very musical style. And it's very concise and very compact, which is also another element of Chicago writers. But there's also, again, a lot of empathy, a lot of compassion as she observes different people in her neighborhood. And that's what a lot of Chicago writers do. A lot of writers like John Porcellino, who we'll also read in the second half of the semester, who are writing about their neighborhoods in the suburbs as well. So again, we're going to get a nice mix of these different writers. But Brooks is important, and as is Sandra Cisneros. Now, Cisneros is younger. She's probably, I would say, the age of maybe your grandparents, about my parents' age, early 70s at this point. Very famous writer, amazing writer, one of the best, again, to come out of Chicago in the last 40 to 50 years. And on Blackboard, you have one of her poems called Good Hot Dogs. And Cisneros learned from Brooks, and Jamila Woods learned from Brooks and Cisneros. So again, we have this kind of tradition, this lineage of these writers who are taking ideas from each other and learning from each other. And it all, in this case, goes back to Gwendolyn Brooks. And this is one of my favorite poems. I liked this poem even before I moved to Chicago 15 years ago. It's called Good Hot Dogs. And in good Chicago tradition, what is it about? It's about hot dogs, right? And she just describes the hot dog. Very, very down to earth, very practical, very vivid poetry. So here's what she says. 50 cents a piece. To eat our lunch, we'd run straight from school instead of home, 2 blocks, then the store that smelled like steam. You ordered because you had the money. 2 hot dogs and 2 pops for here. Everything on the hot dogs except pickle lily. Dash those hot dogs into buns and splash on all the good stuff, yellow mustard and onions, French fries piled on top, rolled up in a piece of wax, paper for us to hold hot in our hands, quarters on the counter. Sit down. Good hot dogs. We'd eat fast till there was nothing left but salt and poppy seeds, even the little burnt tips of French fries. We'd eat, you humming and me swinging my legs. That's a portrait of her and a friend of hers from middle school, I think. So this is probably set in the early 60s when she was a kid, going and having hot dogs. And you are all probably more Chicagoans than I am. I'm originally from the East Coast and only moved here 15 years ago. So I had to learn the ways of the Chicago hot dog when I first got here. We have different style hot dogs back on the East Coast. So this is a portrait of a Chicago hot dog, and that's all it is. Now, you could say it's also a celebration of her neighborhood, of this childhood memory, of this friend that she had. But that's the kind of template that someone like Jamila Woods, who's in her early 30s, she's a younger poet. She's also a singer and a songwriter. So when you're reading her poem for that second half of the midterm and you're getting ready to respond to it, keep these poems in mind as well, because Chicago poets, especially those who were writing in the last century at least, tend to write about their neighborhoods. They tend to write about their memories. They tend to write very short, compact, simple, straightforward, very Midwestern, no nonsense poetry. And often it's filled with a lot of compassion, a lot of humor, as you can see. So the reason I've given you all those different readings is, again, not only because we're going to read more of these folks after the midterm, but also because I want to see how you respond to Jamila Woods. And as I've said in other videos, don't look up anything else about her. Don't look up a biography of her. All you need to do is read the poem. You can read a little bit more about her if you'd like to on the Poetry Foundation website. I have a link up there also in Blackboard. But really reflect on it. You don't need to find a deeper meaning in the poem. All you need to do is enjoy it, see how it resonates with you. If you, in your response, on the midterm want to tell me that it wasn't your favorite poem, you can talk about that. You can critique it if you want to, the Daddy Dozens. If you enjoyed it and got a good laugh out of it and got some kind of emotional sense about how she feels about her dad, that's also valid. But those are the kind of responses that we'll also be doing a little bit in paper number 4 when we get through the midterm. So it's a little bit of a preview for that second half of the semester and the kind of responses that you'll be writing to these kinds of writers. Okay, so again, I hope you like the poems. I hope you enjoy reading them. They're also kind of good to read in the middle of the semester when I'm sure you have other midterm stuff you're going through. So they're faster readings. They're not as lengthy maybe as some of the essays that we did. So if you have any questions on them, let me know. Any other questions on the midterm directions, please let me know. And again, hope you enjoy these. And if you write poems yourself, maybe you'll get inspired and write something that is based on this earlier line and tradition of Chicago writers. All right, so talk to you later.